All right, we're all set to begin.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pamela Robinson, and I'm the Interim Academic Director for City Building Ryerson. On behalf of City Building Ryerson and the Ryerson University community, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming. It's a wonderful thing when these Zoom webinars start to see all of the numbers start to roll in. We're pleased this morning to present this discussion between renowned urban planner Alain Bertaud and Diana Petramala from the Ryerson Centre for Urban Research and Land Development in honor of National Housing Day. Before we begin, I'd like to conduct our land acknowledgement. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabeg, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. This land acknowledgement is particularly important for those of us who are engaged in the planning and shaping of cities, in part because we are here because of the good faith and the generosity of our Indigenous colleagues. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. All participants are on mute. Please submit your questions using the chat function. We really welcome your questions. This will be a lively discussion. This session is being recorded and will be posted later on City Building Ryerson's website, and we encourage you to share it. If you're so interested, we'd also encourage you to tweet and tag City Building RU and Ryerson CUR or CUR as part of this session. This will help us make sure that as many people as possible get to participate in the learning that will come from this session. Now I'd like to hand the session over to Diana Petramala. She's the Senior Economist at Ryerson Centre for Urban Research. Over to you, Diana.
Thanks, Pamela, and thanks everyone for joining. Did you know that Toronto is home to the 5th most expensive housing market of its size in the world? And it's increasingly becoming much more difficult to provide housing for low-income households, and it's becoming increasingly more expensive for medium-income households to find appropriate housing. So what's the government to do about it? And to answer this question, we have invited Alain Bertaud. He is the Senior Fellow at the Marron Institute of Urban Management, New York University, and a former Principal Urban Planner at the World Bank. More importantly, he's written an amazing book, you should read it, Order Without Design, How Markets Shape Cities. And in chapter 6 of his book, Alain Bertaud developed a data tool for analyzing housing policy issues. Now, I'm Diana Petramala from the Center for Urban Research of Land and Land Development, where my colleague Frank Clayton has been working on applying Alain's diagnostic tool to the Greater Toronto area. So the objective of today's webinar is to present this tool to you and to have Alain show you how to use it for analyzing various housing policy objectives in the Greater Toronto area. Sorry, did we all just miss my whole spiel because I was on mute?
Yes, you were just on mute for a little bit there, Diana, sorry.
Okay.
Diana, we caught your spiel, we caught your introduction, so you might just want to proceed with your presentation.
Okay, great. Can I see the agenda slide, please? So in order to do this, we are first going to give you a definition of what a socially acceptable level of housing is in Canada, as defined by core housing need. Then I'm going to explain to you Alain's diagnostic tool broken down into its components. Being an economist, I love this, demand and supply, and how we are applying it to the Greater Toronto area. And then we will summarize Kerr's work on this topic. And then we're going to have Alain Bertaud comment on Kerr's model. And then we're going to have a lively discussion between Kerr's research students and Alain Bertaud, where they're going to throw their questions at Alain, and he's going to answer their housing policy questions using this tool. This will then be followed by a general Q&A session. So we do ask that you submit your questions that you may have in the chat. You can do it as we're going through the presentation, or you can leave it to the end as you wish. Okay, and I'm going to move over to my slides. So as mentioned, my colleague Frank Clayton has been working on trying to adapt Alain's diagnostic tool for the Greater Toronto area. One of the things, I guess, that is important when you're thinking about housing policy is deriving your policy objective. In doing this, governments have to come up with, or should come up with, a definition of what they believe is socially acceptable standard of housing. What type of housing do they want to see everyone living in? And this can be in the frame of size. It could be in the objective of obtaining a number of bedrooms per person, or it can even be living within an acceptable time frame of commute within work. In Canada, we actually do have a definition of what socially acceptable standard of housing is. And this was defined by CMHC in the 1980s as core housing need. And so the socially acceptable standard of housing in Canada is that the housing is acceptable, so it doesn't need major repairs that the household cannot afford. It is suitable, so has a suitable number of bedrooms for the makeup of the family. The definition is a maximum of 2 people per bedroom, but this depends on the age and structure of your family. For instance, if you have 2 5-year-old children, they can share a room. But if you have 2 adult 18-year-old children, they would need their own individual room. And affordable. Affordable means that you do not have to pay more than 30% of your income to obtaining suitable housing. So households who are in the definition of core housing need are households who do not meet one of these standards and cannot afford to find housing to meet these standards. An example of someone living in core housing need is, my father came over here from Italy, and the second he could put together a down payment, he purchased a 3-bedroom house. But in that 3-bedroom house lived him, his parents, and his 3 siblings, their collective 6 children and spouses. So they were in core housing need because they did not have enough bedrooms per person in the household. Just to sort of revisit the plight of the middle income, my dad went to work to make sure that his children could go to school and have a better life, and neither 3 of us can afford that house he first purchased when he came from Italy in the Greater Toronto area. Now to the diagnostic tool, and we're going to talk about the first part first. This is demand. So based on Alain Bertaud's diagnostic tool, we have to be able to put a number around people who need housing. You need to know how many people you need to support. So he built what he calls the demand curve. And here I'm going to explain it to you. On the vertical axis, we have number of households. And on the horizontal axis, we have income levels. I'm going to draw your attention to the blue line. And the blue line is number of households. So this blue line represents almost 2 million households in the Greater Toronto area. And what this is telling us is roughly 160,000 of those households make between $40,000 and $50,000. Moving along, another example along the curve, roughly 80,000 of these households make $130,000. Now I'm going to bring your attention to the green bar, and these are the number of households who are living in core housing need. And what this is showing us that all households living in core housing need are households who earn under $70,000 per year, but majority of them are those who are low income and are earning between $20,000 and $50,000 per year. So this is the demand curve, and this gives us an idea of who's demanding housing at each sort of level of income. And what we're seeing here is roughly 400,000 households are living in core housing need in the Greater Toronto area. Next is the supply side. We want to measure the supply side. So how much housing is each household consuming by income level? Alain Bertaud in his book uses square footage per household. We do not have this data available for us in the Greater Toronto area. We do have data such as rooms per person, but here we've decided just to look at the number of new housing being built per household by income level over the period of 2006 to 2016. So on the horizontal line, again, we have the same scale as we did on the prior chart. We have income levels. And then the vertical axis this time is the change in the number of occupied dwellings. So the new units that were completed and moved into by households. And what we're seeing here is units built for households earning between $10,000 and $120,000 grew at about 15% between 2006 and 2016, but we're growing by almost double that for households who earn over $130,000 per year. So yes, there was increase in supply of housing for lower income households, but it was being far more outpaced or the supply of housing was far being outpaced for households who earn over $130,000. So a lot more housing being built for higher income earning households. So I just wanted to show the diagnostic tool in putting it all together. So Alain Bertaud, when he looks at his policy analysis, he puts both these charts. The demand side chart goes on the bottom, the supply chart goes on the top. So I want to bring your attention to the left side of the screen, and that's what this is the combined diagnostic tool. And now I want to bring your eyes over to the right side of the screen where, if we think about what housing policy objectives should be, it should be to increase the consumption of housing, particularly for those who are not meeting a socially acceptable level of housing. And so the goal of government would be to shift that supply curve up, increase housing consumption for everyone. So to wrap it up, we've just presented a data tool to analyze housing policy in the Greater Toronto Area. We've just presented the tool. Alain Bertaud is going to talk about the application of this tool. What we've seen is households earning $50,000 or less have the largest housing need, but markets are also not addressing the housing need of middle income households in the Greater Toronto Area. Now we will turn it over to Alain for his comments.
Thank you for this presentation. First, I have to acknowledge that I've visited Toronto several times, but I have never worked there, and I had a lot of briefing with Diana several times when I was there. But so I am not certainly an expert on Toronto or Toronto problem. So I will just address a question of maybe methodology of approach. I will not try to give you a solution. I'm completely ignorant of those things. So here, when I look at this graph here, one thing what strikes me is that if you look at the lowest income area, let's say below 30,000, so you have a number of people here who are rather low income. They are the lowest income, but they can afford some type of housing apparently, and it's socially acceptable. So I think that it will be good in the future to superimpose on this graph a typology of what type of housing is that? Is it far away in the suburbs, or is it rent control? Is it public housing? I think it would be good to understand how is it possible that some part of this low income group are able to afford this? So it's possible that it's part of the older housing stock too, which has lower rent, because it's possible, but I think it would be good to know that. The other thing is, here we are, if we look at the supply side, we have a huge increase here, and So what this will mean is that, by the way, it's a percentage of the group, right? So it's not in absolute term. It doesn't mean that it is a very, very large number, because the higher income group are, they are less numerous. So I think that what it will suggest here is that there is a trickle down from higher income group moving into newer and probably better housing, but then liberating housing in the area, let's say 140,000 or something like that. So so that will be. However, what is important is to look at the profile of the demand curve here, because the higher income group are much less numerous than the higher income group. If there is a trickle down, it will stop very quickly, because as soon as you move left toward the lowest income group, you are, in fact, the number of people in the demand for housing are much higher. So here, probably this, the graph here will suggest that there is a trickle down of housing toward the lowest income group. I don't think that in the case of Toronto, because of the shape of the curve, it will work very well. So the next thing is, of course, then how do you increase the supply? And so when I look at the Toronto Google image, and also from my visit with Diana last time I was in Toronto, what is striking in Toronto compared to many cities of other cities in the world is that the drop of density when you move from the core city center, where you have a mix of office building and apartment, and suddenly you have a drop of density, and it looks like a faraway suburbs. I measure on Google Earth, I measure that within a kilometer and 1.2 kilometer from the city center, you have really lot of individual houses, detached housing in relative extremely low density. And I think that this sudden drop of density is probably part of the problem in a certain way. Probably it will require. Now you could argue that people in Toronto are very attached to the way the city is right now and don't want it to change, and that those large area of individual housing close to the city center should stay the way they are, because that's the way people like it. If this is so, then you should develop an enormous system of transport, rapid transport, to expand the suburbs. You cannot have a system where you freeze the existing supply in what is already built, and then at the same time do not expand the city, but expand it not only in terms of distance, but in terms of transport. You have to have rapid transport so that people who can have access to a suburban area, faraway suburban area, have access to where the jobs are. Don't forget that the city is a labor market. To provide housing is not the main problem. You have to provide housing in an area where people have access to jobs, and not only the job in the neighborhood, but if people move to Toronto, it's because there is a huge job market in Toronto, and it's a prosperous city because a lot of jobs are created. So anybody who lives in Toronto, whether it's in the center, closest center, or in the suburb, should have access to practically all the rest of the city where the jobs are in less than 1 hour transport. So I think that in your policy, you have a choice between modifying the land use of the area which are closer to where most of the jobs are, increasing the density there, or if you don't want to do that, if you consider that as a like a heritage, architectural heritage, which is possible, then you will have to expand the infrastructure. You will have to spend a lot on infrastructure. The idea is not to just develop land in the suburbs, but to link this land which is developed to the rest of the city, so people can move anywhere in the city in less than 1 hour. So it's a question either way of either very large investment in infrastructure or land use changes.
Thanks, Alain. I think it's really important to drive that home that it's not just necessarily zoning or land use, but also the investment in especially transport infrastructure.
Right, yes, yes, yes.
I think that's really important, something we don't often or vocalize here.
Yeah, you see, for instance, I will
Yeah.
give the example of, you know, the city of Mexico. Mexico had a huge program of affordable housing. And in a way, they were successful if you look at the number of houses they built. But they built in faraway suburbs where land was not expensive. And after those were heavily subsidized, people acquired them with the subsidy, but they didn't live there. You know, many of them then became abandoned because they were just too far away from jobs. So, you know, the idea is not to build good houses somewhere, is to link them to the job market. And that requires a lot of investment either way, you know. So you make a trade-off, changing land, you know, expanding the city on cheap land, but spending a lot of infrastructure, or spending less on infrastructure, but modifying your land use in the existing city.
I've done a little bit of research into this, and also interesting is that the lowest income neighborhoods in the GTA get the least amount of transport infrastructure.
Yes. Yes. Well, that's probably, by the way, why they are cheaper.
Yeah. And the other thing too, when we did in our report, we actually do break down the low income or the demand curve into renters, and just sort of conversation where there's clearly housing for lower income households. Just two things there. We do break it down between renters and owners, and it does look like a significant share of renters who are low income are living in core housing need. So the ones that are not so much living in core housing need are owners. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that these are people who may have purchased their homes 20, 40 years ago, and their home values have appreciated and their incomes have not, but they can still afford to live in their house because they've paid it down. And the other thing too is social housing. We do have data now on core housing need broken down by people who live in social housing need, or in social housing versus people who don't. And people who are obviously living in or low income and living in social housing are less likely to live in core housing need than even higher income households or medium income households not living in social housing. But it's just the delivery of social housing here in Canada or the Greater Toronto area.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting in a later stage to complete the demand curve here with a little more nuance on the housing stock. You know, in a way, this curve here, the blue curve in the bottom of the graph, represent also the housing stock, and you could divide it into the housing stock, including, for instance, you know, the public housing, if you have such public housing, even at you know, in New York, for instance, at the extreme left, you know, the lowest income group, I will put, you know, the homeless population, which, for instance, in New York is 60,000 people. You know, it's not insignificant. So you will have a complete this curve give you a complete diagnosis of, you know, the different type of housing which are affordable, or, you know, which are occupied at this moment.
Thank you. I think that's stuff to think about when we move on to our final draft. I do think, if it's okay with you, if we move on to the questions from the students.
Yes, certainly.
Okay. I'm going to introduce our students now. Kerr uses student researchers to do all of our work. Our students come from the School of Urban and Regional Planning. And we have with us all of our students working with us currently. We have Hannah and Ty, who are in their second year of the master's program at the school. And we have Victoria, who is finishing off her undergrad at the school. And then we have Daniel. Daniel actually is the student who helped work on this research that we're doing here with Alain Bertaud's diagnostic tool. Daniel graduated from the master's program last year and has been working with us full time ever since. So I'm going to turn over the questions to the students, and I believe we have Ty on board to ask his question first.
Hi, Alain. Thank you so much for spending the time to speak with us today. My question is about inclusionary zoning. So Toronto is looking at implementing some sort of inclusionary zoning policy. I've seen numbers that inclusionary requirements will range anywhere from 3 to 30% of total units being dedicated to affordable housing. What would an inclusionary zoning policy like this do to the supply curve? And is there kind of a magic number that would help municipalities meet the housing needs of low to medium income households?
I think that inclusionary zoning, in a way, what is it? I have a bit of a problem with the concept of inclusionary zoning for one reason, is that the supply of housing for the lower income groups, which are usually more numerous than the high income group, depends on the demand of the high income group. What trigger? You cannot build inclusionary zoning unless there is a demand from higher income group. And so, but those higher income groups are less numerous than the lower income group. But at the same time, to make it feasible, you have to have something like 70% of high income group in order to provide 30% apartment for lower income group, or sometimes, in New York, it's 75, 25%. So here, I am a bit uneasy with that. And all the program I have seen all over because, this inclusionary zoning is used practically a bit everywhere in the world now. And everywhere where I have seen the program working, and some people say, well, it works well because every year, for instance, we provide, 5,000 units of affordable housing. Every time there's a lottery. For instance, in New York, every time you have a new housing, project, and you have, say, 200 or 300 apartments, which are affordable, quote, affordable, you have a lottery, and usually you have 100,000 people applying for the lottery, and only for 200 things. So if this is repeated years after years, it shows that it's not a solution. It gives the impression of a solution. A lottery is not a way of spreading, reducing inequality. And if the system remains a lottery, and in a way you can calculate it whether it's going to remain a lottery. I feel a little uneasy also to divide the entire housing stock between market and non-market. If the non-market is, let's say, the 10% poorest, I have no problem with that. As soon as the non-market reach 50%, and sometimes that's the case, then you have a problem, because in a way, inclusionary zoning require that, in a way, it's a tax on housing. And so you put a tax on housing on some people, but that means that the housing which is on market is going to be more expensive. That means that you increase the number of people who will be require assistance. It's a kind of there is, I think, a contradiction. My other problem with inclusionary zoning is that usually it requires, in order for developers to do it, you need to give them an incentive. This incentive is an increase in the floor ratio, increase in the height of building. So in order for developers, this has a very high value. It has a very high value precisely because the regulation has been preventing, in a way, building from being built. So in order to keep the value for the developer, the state has to be even more repressive in order that, in a way, it creates a shortage, and then it negotiates a price for this shortage. So in a way, the city acts as a monopoly on floor space. and then negotiate as a good monopolist. It negotiates with developers the highest price possible for this floor space. So you see that if normally you require, you restrict the height of building, because the height of building could create negative externalities, shadows, overcrowding of the street or something like that. So in a way, inclusionary zoning, which arbitrarily increase the floor ratio, just show that this constraint do not really exist, that it's arbitrary, because the city can remove it just because, in order to get more housing. So why not allow more housing to be built in the first place? You see, it's a bit, if you look at all the land use regulation are there to restrict the number of housing which can be built in a unit of land, either minimum plot size, or floor ratio, or setbacks. All these are to restrict. The assumption is that the market will the demand will be for higher density, smaller lot, smaller floor plans, and things like that. And the regulation are pushing you to use more land, use more floor space, and things like that. So I think that you have to do an audit of your regulation. Now, there are a lot of, most people who live in a city do not want change. So there is a resistance against that. If there is such resistance, then the only way is to expand in the suburbs.
I went to a City of Toronto run event where they invited land use planners from New York and I believe it was Boston, talking about implementing inclusionary zoning there. And I think they must have gotten 3 times the question, what is the impact of inclusionary zoning on market housing? And all 3 times the answer basically was, who cares?
Yes.
But I guess if I'm looking here at the GTA demand curve, I guess what we would think when we're thinking about inclusionary zoning, we would say, well, there's a whole lot of people who earn under 100,000, and the market units in these buildings are going to go to people who earn probably the higher income households. So you would never get enough units in general to make a dent in the core housing need, or even in providing housing for low income households. Is that correct?
I don't think so. Look at if you look at everything else, there is always a market, especially if you look at the demand curve. These are sorry, maybe I should try to annotate, and can you see my mouse here?
I can't see your mouse, but I think if you draw, we will.
Huh? You can see it?
I can't see your mouse, but once you draw, we will. We'll be able to see what you draw.
Okay.
Sorry, we're working on a new tool we learned.
Sorry. You see here, sorry, I should get our here. Oh, that's not exactly what I wanted to do. In this area, you have a lot of demand for housing, obviously. Housing for people who earn 50,000, 60,000. I mean, this is not insignificant. These are not very poor people. They are not desperate. They are not homeless people. They have a job, certainly a regular job. There is no reason why the market will not provide housing for those people if you remove a lot of things. If it takes 5 years to build an apartment building because you have so many commission, you are to go in front, you have to, you in a way, this adds to the cost. In New York, for instance, when you build housing, I would say about 20% of the price of housing goes to lawyers. In order to go through commission, you cannot build anything without having a lot of hurdles. So I think that there is no reason why the market will not provide that. In any other area, you see that, for instance, if you look at food, you have very cheap restaurants, you have even food cart in the sidewalk. So the market is not concentrating on high income. But imagine that you have a regulation which says that every food provider should provide 3 courses and it should be served this way and this way. And this is what we are doing for housing. We have to do a complete audit of our housing supply system. The idea that there is no possibility for the market to provide for the majority of the population is, I think, not true. It's something we have built ourselves. And again, the alternative, if you subsidize, be frank, if you subsidize 50% of the housing stock, practically here, this is, in a way, what you are saying. Eventually, you are going to ask people to pay taxes to pay for their own houses. The idea that only the very rich will pay is just not true. At the end, everybody, they will pay. So you end up with a system which do not quite work. And I think that to look again at infrastructure, the subsidy, I think, should go to probably infrastructure and much less on housing itself, the construction of housing. And I think that there must be a way of doing it. Again, my experience is always on regulation. And if you really audit the regulation, look at somebody who wants to build for somebody earning $50,000 here. What do they have to go through? Why can't they build? Is it it's not the price per square meter of floor space, which is expensive. It is a building itself built on a certain piece of land. So I think that this is what we have to look at. If we now there is a part of the population which need complete assistance, and I agree with that. And is it the people who are, say, below 30,000, or I don't know, certainly, but it cannot be as soon as you reach close to 50% of the population, or say 40%. I think you have to find a market solution. If not, you are going to have waiting lists. In New York, for instance, you have waiting lists for public housing of 12 or 15 years. This is not serious. If you are a school teacher and you move to Toronto and you have a job in Toronto as a school teacher, you should be able to have an apartment or a house within a month. If you are on the waiting list for 15 years, this is not serious. Sorry, I took too long to answer this. You should check me out.
I think you've answered majority of the upcoming students' questions, but we'll try anyways. Hannah, do you want to ask your question?
Hello, thank you. I have a question. I have been studying Vienna and have noticed that their affordable housing policies are heavily focused on supply side subsidies, such as subsidies for developers to build affordable housing. In contrast, Canada has focused on demand side subsidies. Canada's biggest subsidy comes in the form of a home buyer's insurance that allows first-time home buyers to only put up a 5% down payment and get a low interest rate. How do these two different strategies each impact the supply curve?
So in general, I am much more in favor of demand side subsidy than supply side subsidy, because it gives much more freedom to the person who receives the subsidy. But let us be clear. If you have a large demand side subsidy and you do not remove the constraint on the supply that I was talking about before, you end up with more expensive houses. You increase the demand, but you block this. You have a constraint on the supply. So this is economics 101. You increase you increase prices. You know, we have seen that in many countries around the world. I've seen that many, many times. So this is a problem also, you know, again, in the US, we have also a demand side subsidy, which is quite important. But if you do not remove the supply side constraint, then your demand side doesn't work. Now, let us go to Vienna. Now, I have never worked, I've visited Vienna many times. It's absolutely a charming city. I never worked in Vienna. And I've been trying to dig numbers. I had problem getting real numbers. You know, I have the number of houses which are built exactly, but I would like to know more about those incentives. You know, in a way, I have the feeling that what the government is doing with developers, but again, I'm not completely sure it's true, is that they are precisely removing the supply constraint that they are imposing on the other. And so Vienna also, for me, it's a bit of a mystery because, again, it's an absolutely charming city. It has especially cultural thing. I mean, it's a city which is not growing and has not been growing for the last 15 years prior. You know, the current rate now is 0.74% per year. You know, it's a rather low rate. The city is relatively small, 1.9 million, and it has a stagnant rate for the last 20 years. At the same time, Vienna is always on the top of the most livable city in the world. You know, there are a number of on the economist side, I think, and there are a number of lists like that. And Vienna is always on top. So for me, the mystery is how come that a city which is so good at providing affordable housing, which has such fantastic amenities, cultural amenities, you know, which are very attractive, very well designed, is not growing. And I don't know what the answer is. Again, I will know if I had an opportunity to work there. You know, you understand a city only if you work there. You know, when you get all the real numbers. So unfortunately, I cannot really answer your question, except to say that probably the Viennese remove the constraint on supply for for their programs, and they do it much better. Let's say I look at the design. The design is better than the public housing. That I don't know how the public housing in Toronto is, but say in New York, it's a dreadful design because it's the clients is really the bureaucrats who build this. It's not the people who are living there. It seems that the Viennese have a better system to respond to the demand of the people who are getting into public housing.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. So my question, you've touched on a lot of the points in my question already, but for some background, Toronto has seen quite a lot of growth in high-paying industries like finance and tech over the last decade, and there's been a corresponding growth in high-income households. But over that time period, we really haven't seen any changes in the zoning. So we still basically forbid all development in areas outside the downtown core, as you mentioned. And we focus all of our development into high-rise buildings or apartments in a very, very limited area of the city. So how does this increasing economic growth in high-income households while we're preventing any medium or low density growth, how is that going to affect housing demand and supply in different income groups?
Yes, I think that this is it's an interesting problem to have. You know, in a way, you have a very dynamic economy, but at the same time, as you say, you have not adapted your zoning to this. And it's striking to see when you look at Toronto, you know, aerial photograph or seeing it from a skyscraper, that you have little island of high densities here and there, probably because those were not developed at a certain time and the government allow high density. But this is not a very rational way of providing housing. You know, normally you will have higher density, you will have a gradient of density decreasing progressively. And high-rise buildings are expensive to build and to operate. So it's fine for high-income housing. And I'm very happy to see, by the way, high-income houses in very tall towers, because it means that they take very little land, but they will be expensive to build and to operate. You know, the utilities in a skyscraper to maintain the utility is very expensive. So this is fine. But for middle-income housing, skyscrapers are not the best way because they are more expensive to build. And so usually 3 or 4 or 5-story buildings are much better. And I don't see many of those in Toronto. You know, you should see them in a belt around, let's say, 2 or 3 kilometers around the CBD of Toronto. You should see, you know, little street with 4 or 5-story building, and you don't see that. So I think that this is again a problem, a zoning problem. Now, I don't neglect the political aspect of it. Is that people living there don't want any change, you know, but the well-known NIMBY. This has to be solved politically. Either, again, you respect that in a way, the way the Parisians do it. You know, Parisians decide in Paris that the entire city of Paris is an historical monument and you cannot build anything, you know, above what is built. So that's a political choice. The result is that most of the jobs are moving to the suburbs. So here in Toronto, you have a political choice. Again, either you keep the existing city, low density city, as an historical monument, which cannot be changed. Why not? You know, it's a political. And then you expand in the suburbs, or you have this system where you build only for very high income, and too bad for the others. And because the higher income can build even higher, you know, they actually like it because you have a better view. You know, if you build a skyscraper of 100 floors, the people who are on the top floor, you know, will have a fantastic view of the lake, of everything. It will be wonderful. So this is fine. And by the way, your question is excellent because, you know, there have been a reaction, including in New York, to say, well, let us stop the growth of jobs in New York and in San Francisco of high-income people, because they increase rents, you know, they increase, and it's true in a certain way, but it's true only because you don't provide enough, you constrain the supply of things. You know, they increase the price of food in a certain way. You will have more expensive restaurants if you have, you know, you have high-income people, but it doesn't mean that you will not find a fast food either. You know, you will also have it. But imagine that you restrict the growth of fast food and you have only expensive, then suddenly, you know, higher income people will increase the price of food in the city too, you know, so we have to look at this that way.
Well, thank you. I guess basically what you're saying here is that this is probably, or the land use restrictions is probably one reason why the curve is shaped the way it actually is. And we're starting to get more data on the housing market in the Greater Toronto area, more broadly across Canada. And we're seeing, you know, a cost per square foot, especially now, condos are far more expensive than even single family homes. So you do see that in the data that high rise.
Yes. Yeah, the high rise, you know, the building cost follow a U curve, you know, and the bottom of the U is about 4 or 5 floor. And after that, it goes up, and it can go up very quickly the more you go.
So now we'll turn to Victoria for her question, and this will be the last student question. We have 10 minutes to get to some what are really good audience questions. So Victoria, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you. So my question is about rent control. So I know that rent control is a very highly contested policy, but Ontario does have rent control in which rent cannot rise more than usually a prescribed rate of 2% per year on controlled occupied units. So I was just wondering what a policy like this would do to the supply curve.
Well, rent control is excellent for the people who are under rent control, but it's not so good for the newcomer. Again, I take always this example of the school teacher who suddenly has a new job, a young school teacher has a new job in a school, and he's looking for a house or apartment. Rent control will not do very much for this person. So on the long run, also, one of the negative effects of rent control is that it prevents mobility of people. If you have a rent control apartment in Toronto or anywhere else, and you have a job in a different part of the city or a suburb or something like that, if you leave your rent control apartment, you lose your subsidy, whatever your income. So you are tied to this. And it's possible that even I've known people like that in New York, for instance, who are using even the rent control apartment in the long run as a pied-à-terre. They are retired, they live in the suburb, but they are still using it. Or in some countries, you have to pay a fee to succeed to a rent control apartment. So it distorts about everything. In the long run, of course, it means that there will be no private sector who will build low-income housing for rental, because they might be on rent control one day, and therefore they cannot make a projection. So you cut completely the supply of new low-income apartments forever. But I agree on that certainly the increase of rents might be regulated. That's it. But in the same way as you regulate contracts between two persons, the way when you renew a contract, there might be a rule which says, well, you cannot increase it more than let's say the increase in the cost of housing or something like that, that you put a regulation on it. But I think that if it's very rigid, if you say it's 2%, for instance, and suddenly you have inflation, then you will have a large part of the stock which will have a rent which is so much below market that nobody can compete with that. So I think that you have to look at that this way. Maybe rent control, let's say, should be formulated more as a way of regulating contract between two persons, rather than setting a fixed, or a rather rigid rent on a type of building.
Thank you.
I guess from the research that I've read, it's kind of rent control is something else that can create a curve that's very much shaped like the one we're seeing here in the GTA, where you get more housing for high income earners and less.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We are going to turn now to audience questions. There was a question on a universal income benefit, and if there's time, maybe we'll come back to that one. But we do want to address some of the audience questions. They are good ones. And this one coming from Jason Mercer from the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. Are there any case comparison examples where other cities have been able to entice developers to build lower cost housing?
Yes, in a way, if you can do that, if you first you have to accelerate the way these things are done. Don't forget that if it takes several years to negotiate a contract with the city to build low-income housing, this is a price on development. And it will, so it slow down, let's say, the supply. So you have to, now, cities which have been successful, if you look at cities in the south of the United States, cities like Atlanta or Houston or Dallas or San Antonio, where they have regulation which are much less constraining than in other parts, you will see that the price of housing is relatively, in particular, the price income ratio is much lower than the rest of the United States, for instance. So there are areas like that. It's a question. There, I have seen cities like that. Strangely enough, in India, again, India, some cities which deregulate suddenly see a reduction in the number of people living in slums. The supply side. You have to really look at the constraint, but it's not. There is not a silver bullet. That's the problem. It's not, say, removing the floor ratio or constraint or something like that. Usually there are about 100 regulations or practice. Sometimes it's not even a regulation, it's a practice. So if you are patient enough to look at all the things, and by the way, by talking with developers, usually you find those things, and which are very costly, but do not result in a benefit. If it takes 5 years to build an apartment building because of the administrative process, it doesn't create any benefit really, but it increases the price, and then it restricts housing to only the very rich. So in general, you see a very strong correlation with regulations and the price of housing. There is no doubt about it. And of course, the other thing is, the way, again, the cities in the south of the United States, for some reason, are unique in they have a way of financing infrastructure through bonds. The municipal, it's called municipal urban district, MUD, and they have a way of financing it through bonds. So it allows the city to expand while ensuring that the infrastructure is provided at the same time. So that's a way of dealing with it. But you see a city like Houston, for instance, now is allowing change to respond to demand in the center of the city, in particular to increase the number of dwelling units on a lot relatively easily, or to build what they call granny flats, to build a second on an existing parcel. So again, this is what is usually to be done. There is no city which is perfect, which solve all the problems. The cities are very complex, and there's a lot of local politics. You cannot take a solution in one city and then completely copy it in another. You can learn from other cities, but you cannot really export it.
Thank you. How will increased digital commuting affect the relationship between job markets and housing supply, especially in areas that are distant from the major job locations?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In a way, if everybody could work digitally, there would be no need for cities. We will all live in a skiing resort or somewhere in or in the Mediterranean island or somewhere, and we could just have access to the job market would be the world job market. You could be in Polynesia and then work in Toronto. So there would be no. But in reality, this is a myth. We certainly can. We will certainly. Many of us will work remote, but that means only probably that we will commute 1 or 2 days a week rather than 5 days a week. I don't believe that in the long run, a lot of people who have the possibility of working remote are going to work remote. There are certain things that you don't get through remote. There are a lot of random contact, random conversation that you have when you meet people face to face. So if I am wrong, then it will mean the complete disappearance of cities in the long run. What I think is likely to happen is that many of us are going to commute only 3 or 4, maybe 2 days a week. That means that we could afford to live a little further away, because if we commute only 2 days a week, we can afford longer commute. It means also that there will be probably less traffic jam, which is a good thing, or less congested subway. The land use will have to adjust too. A lot of the services then which were close to office building will have to be found somewhere, maybe in the suburbs. So again, here we are calling for enormous flexibility in land use regulation in order to adapt to this new situation. So that's what but I think that cities really are made by decision of people and firms, enterprise. These are urban planners do not take decision, or mayor do not take decision about the shape of cities. It is people and firms. So we have to monitor very, very, very closely what people and firms are doing, during the pandemic and after the pandemic. And we have to adjust our infrastructure and land use to respond to this spontaneous shaping of cities by the people themselves and by the firms who are providing jobs.
That's the shift to working from home though is quite detrimental to small businesses as we're
Yes.
there. If you don't have everyone congregating in circles, the businesses collapse all of a sudden. So
Right. Yes. Yes, and I think this the collapse of some retail business already happened before the pandemic, by the way. I don't know in Toronto, but in New York it was very clear. Department store had a hard time. So this was a trend. Again, here I think there are a lot more jobs which could be provided, service job, type of restaurants, bar, entertaining, things like that, or even bookstore, by the way. But then that will require much more flexibility in the land use, in order to adapt quickly to this new demand. And including in the suburbs, it's possible that a lot of the service job, like restaurant or bar, which were concentrated in the center, will emigrate in the suburbs. Because again, if you work at home, at the same time, you need to get out of your home and meet other people. And it's possible that you will meet them in the suburbs rather than in the center. I don't know. But again, I am agnostic on that. I think that the major job of the urban planner is to monitor what is happening rather than dictating and to provide the infrastructure to support what is happening.
So this question, I have a question coming from someone, this is probably a bit more on sort of the macroeconomic side of it, but I'd be curious to know if you have any sort of view on this also. There's this documentary that came out on the financialization of housing.
Yes.
The UN, forget her name, but she did this documentary focusing on the Greater Toronto area, but also touching on examples from other places in the world like London, I believe Milan and New York, on the financialization of housing. And they touched a lot about money laundering too. But I think it was more this idea that there's all this capital flowing into housing, either as more of an investment rather than a use or a consumer good. And so that was really driving housing inequality. Basically, so I was just wondering if you have any views on this. I mean, my perspective is financial, like housing as an asset is a financial asset, and then the use of it is a consumer good. So
yes, this could be, this actually is not completely new. There were countries already, a country like Switzerland, many, many years ago already had this problem about real estate, that people were from all over the world and were in high finance and sometimes not necessarily in a very honest finance, would like to have a pied-à-terre in Switzerland because it's a way of putting their money and also getting refuge. And the Swiss were faced with suddenly the price of land in a rural area in Switzerland, were suddenly the target of people, let's say an oligarch from Russia who wanted to buy a piece of land in a village. And that created, of course, havoc in the economy of a village, because the price of land had nothing to do with how many cow you can raise there, or whatever you can, vegetable you can grow. So the Swiss then put boundaries around, and in some area, for instance, in the center of big city, everybody can buy real estate, but not in rural areas. And I think that if this phenomenon is really very important, it's possible that the state could intervene in that. But it should be really very well documented, because housing as an investment, on the other hand, is not a bad thing. A country like, by the way, Switzerland or Germany, you have more renters than owners for some reason. And there are big companies who have been investing in rental housing, and it's relatively affordable. So it's not a bad thing in itself. It's a bad thing if, let's say, if it's, as you say, a way of laundering money or placing money because you have no, but if it's an industry, I don't think it's a bad thing. So really it's a bit out, as you mentioned, a bit outside my specialty, but I would be very cautious before doing something, but it's worth looking into it, whether it has really an effect.
Okay, and I'm just going to take one more question from the audience now. And this person is saying, so it's coming from Anthony DiCenzo. So Alain's points on costs are interesting. As mid-rise buildings tend to be more expensive to build, I guess this would be in the GTA, due to increased risk on the developer side. So I guess it's not really a cost thing, but a risk thing.
Yes.
Design tends to be less efficient. Construction costs tend to be higher, price per square foot. So developers tend to pursue a luxury model for those mid-rise buildings. Based on what has been discussed, regulations as a problem area and affordability, is regulation the best level to de-risk these mid-rise projects and incentivize mid-rise building construction for lower income levels?
Regulation cannot make something happen. Regulation can only prevent things from happening. And if you say this neighborhood is going to be a 5-story building, and you zone it for 5-story building, it doesn't mean that you will have 5-story building. You will have 5-story building if there is demand and supply in this neighborhood for 5-story building. However, if you say this can be no more than 5-story building and there is a lot of demand, then you will have 5-story building, because you have a restriction on supply, but the demand is already there. So regulation can be only so much, but I think that if you were trying to design regulation so that when you think there is demand for building in an area, and you will allow this type of building, then yes, it will happen, certainly. But you cannot, it's not a question of zoning for an area for low income or high income. It's to remove the regulation which prevent innovation, in particular prevent innovation.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I answered this question exactly, but
That was a good one. I think sometimes when you look at the numbers, I think mid-rise in certain areas could be unaffordable or unprofitable, but I don't know if mid-rises are unprofitable versus a high-rise with luxury condos is just going to be more profitable. So the incentives are to build.
yeah.
And so
you have to look also at all the regulation. For instance, say on mid-rise, you have also a lot of regulations about parkings and things like that. So you have to look at all the regulation, all the permits, all the thing which has to be, and indeed it increased risk, and it discourage people who are dealing with low-income housing, usually on a commercial basis, have relatively low margin, and they do it because there is a lot of demand for that, and they can they can replicate it easily. That's what is happening in the fast food business. They replicate it very quickly. They have low margin. So if a developer has low margin because he or she is building low-income housing, but then you had a lot of things which increase risk, and therefore increase financial risk, then the margin could disappear very quickly, and this developer will go bankrupt. So that's why we have to look at this process, not only the regulation, but all the process itself, in order to know why is it so.
Okay, I'm getting the wrap-up sign, so thank you so much, Alain, for joining us today. This was very insightful and great. We look forward to hearing from you more in the future.
Thank you. And again, I regret that I don't know enough about Toronto to be able to give the silver bullet, which does not exist. Okay, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.